To my church folks, and this also include people who grew up in a church, left church, whatever your relationship is with the church, I have a quick question. What aspect of traditional church structures do you find to be the most problematic? I'll kick it off because I have a pretty long list, but this one was definitely at the top of it. I've said this before, but I'll say it again when answering this question because it really does matter. I spent over 20 years of my life growing up in a Hebrew Israelite church. For me, when I think about the traditional aspects of church that I find to be the most problematic, for me, that's going to be how heavily the church and church communities focus on obedience, blind obedience, and submissiveness. And what that looks like for women, and especially what that looks like for young girls who grew up in the church. Not people who went to church when they were grown, but people and young girls who grew up in the church, because I do feel like that is a much different experience. So at my church, like in many other churches, women were not allowed to teach. They were not allowed to lead committees. And when I say committees, we had a feast committees for a feast that we would have throughout the year, which are our religious holidays. And we would also have like the repast committees for funerals. And we also had like a research committee, prison ministry, all of that. And regardless of the skill set, regardless of the background, women were not allowed to lead committees. They were allowed to be on the committees and still do the work, but they weren't under any circumstances allowed to lead the communities, lead the committees, or teach. And even when it comes to my church, they are heavy on YouTube. They have a number of shows on YouTube. People have their own shows. People are in Clubhouse, and women aren't allowed to speak, teach, none of that. And so layer in that, then focusing on young girls who grew up in the church. I feel like when it comes to children, but young girls especially, there's always this heavy focus on obedience. And if you grew up in church, I'm sure you've heard those scriptures that people love to quote about how children should honor their mother and father and their days shall be long. I know y'all have heard it before if y'all grew up in a church, right? And so then I think about a lot of the messaging there about how children should be obedient to their parents. And growing up in church, it always came with the caveat of, oh, it doesn't say honor your parents if they weren't a good parent, or you don't need to honor your parents if this, that, the third happened. It just said honor your parents, no caveats, no exceptions. So whatever your parents do, you still have to honor them, all of that, right? So it's then this constant theme of obedience, blind obedience, regardless of how your parents treat you, right? Another thing that I'll say, and church folks will try to argue with me on this, but oftentimes what makes it into a lot of church sermons isn't always scriptural, but a lot of times it's cultural and a lot of times societal, and it's going to reflect the overall beliefs of just the main population in the church. And I went to an older Black church, so a lot of those societal beliefs, of course, oftentimes made it into the sermons, lessons, whatever you want to call it. And so what I then see is that we have a lot of these antiquated gender roles and stereotypes that we have set for people that are cultural, that people are then using scripture to then defend whatever beliefs that they have about what men and women should do. And in addition to that, and I know we've heard the saying that children should be seen and not heard. So you also have you have this blind obedience in terms of like age, where children are often looked at as property, not as their own individual human beings. We then have the obedience and the submissiveness is expected of women when they're not allowed to lead, they're not allowed to teach, whereas essentially people just got to do what they're told. And then there's also this constant thing of when people start asking questions, when people start pushing back, there is, well, I feel like we all know how sometimes churches can respond to questions that are often written as people being very defiant or just challenging, not challenging the church. People always took it back to challenging God. And what is always disheartening is seeing how people would always weaponize the scripture to back up whatever their beliefs was. So when women weren't allowed to do certain things within the church, whenever we had sermons that focused on what women should do, the expectation of wives, it was always, oh, we're not saying this. We're not the ones who's saying this. Oh, it's in the Bible. God is saying this. Be mad at God. So is this heavy expectation and the weaponizing of the scripture to then justify a lot of cultural and societal beliefs around what women and children, especially young girls, should do. And I could go on, but just the heavy focus on blind obedience and submissiveness is the one that really does send me.